Café Scientifique is a monthly series of expert-led discussions on science and culture presented by the Bell Museum of Natural History. For more information about the Bell Museum, or to find out about upcoming Café Scientifique programs, visit bellmuseum.org or find us on Facebook and Twitter.
Good evening and welcome to Café Scientifique. Yeah, all right. Woo. If you want to know anything about the new Bell Museum, the new building, just go to the Bell Museum webpage and there's a whole bunch of stuff and some pictures. You'll want to see that. I am going to turn it over to the brains of our organization who runs this show, Leah Peterson. Thank you. Good job.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Who in the audience is at their first Café Scientifique? Just wondering. Oh, great. Like almost everybody up in front and then a few people in the back. Of course, there's familiar faces up here, too. And who knows who sponsors the Bell Museum, Café Scientifique, that is. The Bell Museum, yes. So welcome. Thanks for making it out in the rain. My name's Leah Peterson, and I'm the coordinator for adult programs at the Bell Museum of Natural History at the University of Minnesota. And this is one of my favorite parts of my job, so it's always such a pleasure to see people come out and enjoy this with us. We have a great speaker tonight. Pat Nunnally is from Tennessee, and he's done river work for over 20 years with 1 foot in the university world and 1 foot in the river community. He said his work is kind of a hybrid crossing between conversations from one world to the other. His PhD, however, is in American Studies from Iowa, which is an interesting contrast for those of you who are here at our last cafe last month to talk about dog evolution, because this is going to be where that was like a lot of charts and graphs and statistics and stuff like that. I think this is going to be, as you might tell from the title, the myths and meanings of the Mississippi. It's going to have a different tone altogether, which is great. It's the range of Café Scientifique for you. Pat's been up and down the length of the Mississippi more than once and is the coordinator of the River Life program, which is at the Institute for Advanced Studies at the University of Minnesota. River Life connects university teaching, research, and programs to people for a sustainable and inclusive future for the river. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Pat Nunnally.
Wow, look at that. Like I said over in the side, I got nothing. We can do some other stuff, and we can maybe not be real serious. I got no charts, no graphs. But other than that, we're going to stick pretty much close to home because, you get one of these things where it's like truth in advertising. I mean, I always feel bad if I give you something that's not what you came in from out of the rain to hear. I appreciate you coming in. And you said I had how long to talk? 2 hours? I mean, I make a living as a teacher sometimes, and you give us 50 minutes, and we go 75 if it's only twice a week. So we all know how that goes, right? There will be a quiz. This is on the midterm, right? Okay, we're good. So what are we talking about? Well, myths. We often think of myths as things that are wrong, or they're fabrications. They're untrue. I would argue that they are fabrications. But the ones I want to talk about are fabrications that explain us to ourselves. What are the stories we tell ourselves so that we say, oh yeah, that's who we are. That's what the river is. That's how the river fits into our community. And meanings is intentionally plural because a lot of people I work with think of the Mississippi as like having one meaning, the meaning of the Mississippi. And they will look back to this quotation that is often cited, T.S. Eliot, who himself grew up along the Mississippi. Eliot wrote in the 40s an introduction to the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and he says, at what point in its course does the Mississippi River become what the Mississippi River means? And that's a pretty interesting question because it raises the question of what the Mississippi River means. What I would argue is that we need to rethink that. We haven't thought about that sufficiently. We're going to do River 101 for a long, long time, and we might do some River 101 tonight. But we're also going to talk about River Future. So what do we know about the Mississippi River? Well, obviously a lot. What do we want to say we know about the Mississippi? This is the point where I catch the students always out having not done their reading. So who did the reading? Yes. The headwaters are in Itasca. Yeah, we'll talk about that. Because one of the things that I'm going to argue our new mythology does is disrupts what we think we know. Because I'm at the university. This is what we get to do, right? We get to disrupt stuff. And so I get to work with people like at the National Park Service or the Minnesota Historical Society, and they have to behave. They have to play by the rules. But universities, we like do subversive, disruptive stuff. So if you feel suitably uncomfortable and disrupted, I guess I would, as a university guy, be pretty happy about that. Leah is probably not happy because she wants you to come back and have a good time.
Well, I want you to come back for that reason, though.
Okay. What else? What else do we know about the Mississippi? Yes.
The dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico is coming from nutrients from the Mississippi River.
The dead zone at the Gulf of Mexico at the mouth of the river is caused by the river. That's right. That's okay. So these are two of the four that I had picked out to talk about. You want to play guess what the teacher's thinking and guess what the other two are? That's always a fun game, right? You remember that from college? Discussion class, a teacher gets up there and poses some kind of thinking question. They always rub their chins. And you're sitting there like, what are you talking about? What do you mean? So, where's the headwaters of the Mississippi? Here? What about here? What about here? All of the above. Because if the river is water that falls on the watershed anywhere, if you're living in Minneapolis, your roof is the headwaters of the Mississippi River. Right? I mean, as a body of water, the main surface water part of it starts here, and we could talk a lot about that, about how that got there and who made that and all that kind of stuff. But this also is the headwaters. This is one of the tributaries, Main Street. Headwaters, right? Headwaters connected to what's coming off the river out at the Gulf of Mexico, the nitrates, phosphorus coming off of farm fields. Those are headwaters of the Mississippi River as well. Somebody's house. Headwaters. Headwaters for a lot of us, this is where a lot of you come from. What? How many of you live in Minneapolis? How many of you live in St. Paul? You are by and large 75% Mississippi River, right? I mean, your body's more or less 75% water. You live in the two Twin Cities. Your drinking water comes from the Mississippi River. That's as much science as I know. We can get over the Scientifique now, right? Okay, good. No, this is the Minneapolis Water Treatment Plant. Up above the Camden Bridge, the island where the Heron Rookery used to be before the tornado came. This is a picture made as part of an overflight commissioned by the Minneapolis Park Board in 2013 to replicate an overflight that the Park Board had also commissioned in 1955. So what stories do we tell? If we have myths and we have meanings, then what comes up next is probably the way by which myths and meanings are conveyed, which for me often has to do with story. So what stories do we tell about the Mississippi River? The sort of archetypal story of the Mississippi River for here in Minneapolis is flour milling, right? What do we know about flour milling in Minneapolis?
Gold medal.
Gold medal. Pillsbury. Center for flour milling in the world between 1880 and 1930. And so I'm sorry?
Flour can blow up.
Flour can and does blow up. That's right. So we have new mills on the locations of the old ones because there were milling explosions, and that led to industrial safety and all kinds of other things. These stories become interconnected. And so when you talk to people, people come to the cities. A lot of times they want to see the Mississippi. So there's a thing that the Humphrey Institute does every summer. It's the Nelson Mandela Fellowship for Young African Leaders. And I take them out on the Stone Arch Bridge. We talk about the Mississippi. All of them have heard about the Mississippi River. All of them have heard about Pillsbury. All of them have heard about General Mills. They don't know necessarily a lot else about the state or about the river, but they've heard of those iconic stories of industry and capital and the assembly of raw materials through industrial processes into finished products that go around the world. The Mill City Museum has in the museum, wherever you live in the world, what happened here has had an impact on you. And that's probably true. Probably true. Wherever, I think we could probably sit here and think of places that are outside the reach of industrial agriculture, but we'd have to work at it. And industrial agriculture, in many respects, begins with the mechanization, the industrial scale growth of wheat production in the Red River Valley of the North up in North Dakota with what they call bonanza farms in the 1870s, and it works down to feed the mills. The other sort of archetypal story we tell and we've told and we've read, probably about the 10th grade, give or take, when I was back in the 20th century when I was in school. We read Huckleberry Finn in American literature in the 10th grade. You have things like Ernest Hemingway, not highly regarded now by a lot of people as a writer, but he's said that every American literature, everything that's truly distinctive about American literature begins with one book, and that book is Huckleberry Finn. So you see, an American studies guy like me, see, I got a literature quote in there, I got a little history going on in there. I was once giving a lecture in a class on urban planning and design. I've done a lot of work, as you could tell, on other kinds of stuff. And I managed to get in one lecture Faulkner and the Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices into one lecture. That I was pretty proud of. That's real work. The MUTCD, that's the thing that means that stop signs are octagonal and red and have the particular variance and the reflectivity and stuff. A great book. Any of you needing to get some sleep one night? The MUTCD is for you. The dead zone in the Gulf. So this is a story we tell about the river now. This is a story we tell that feeds a lot of our environmentalist sensibilities about what we are doing to the earth and the earth systems that are damaging those systems that need remediation. Okay, that's fine. How many, so I'll go Kevin on you here. What percentage of people in the United States do you suppose have ever had their behavior change by being made to feel guilty for something like that?
1%.
Huh?
1%?
You're an optimist. And so the green movement, if you will, if you'll permit me the notion of there being a green movement and not green movements, is really coming to terms with the stories that it tells and how it approaches people and who it's approaching and who's involved in it. These are things we might come back to. But so there's the dead zone. This is a story we tell about the importance of the river. It's a critically important story. Don't get me wrong for a minute. It's a critically, vitally important story in terms of talking about how the land that is on 40% of the continental United States feeds a failure of system in the Gulf of Mexico. And this happens all the time, and it happens because of things that we basically have decided we want to happen, and that's namely cheap food. And I'm all for cheap food. We also tell stories, this is more of an insider game, about how the upper Mississippi is managed for navigation as opposed to being managed for the benefit of nature. In 1986, the Water Resource Development Act, with the MUTCD, now I'm establishing some insider cred in some other circles, right? I'm not a scientist, but boy, I can throw jargon and acronyms around like nobody's business, right? Okay, good. The WRDA, the WRDA, which is the federal law that every 5 years or so ago sets policy for the management of basically the inland waterway system, the waters of the United States. In 1986 or 87, I'm not sure, WRDA declared that it was the policy of the federal government that the upper Mississippi will be a nationally significant ecosystem and a nationally significant transportation system. 60% of the agricultural exports in the country, a figure that's in billions of dollars, like tens of billions of dollars, goes out of the country through the Mississippi River and the inland waterway system every year. This is a big deal. A bunch of farmers throughout the midsection of the country absolutely depend on the smooth and efficient workings of the Mississippi River as a nationally and internationally significant transportation system. But the upper Mississippi is also the flyway for 40% of the migratory birds in North America. Those are things that need to be managed together. The law doesn't say the river is one or the other. It says it is both. It is federal law to manage the river as a transportation system and as a ecosystem. Now, these are stories. The key here is that we're telling these stories as verses, and I would suggest we need to find a new way to do that. So, the stories we tell. I'm going to suggest to you that some of the stories we tell are sort of founding myths, if you will. There are stories about who we are and how we got here. Flour milling as the sort of origin point for the city of Minneapolis. It's how the city of Minneapolis is here. It's why it's here. It's why the city really came to be a great city. Some of our myths are stories that tell transition. They're stories that say, here's how we have come to be who we are. This is who we started as, but I don't guess probably most of you are working in the flour milling business now, right? Got anybody working in flour milling? Maybe somebody in marketing at General Mills? But you're probably not putting flour in sacks and loading them on railroad cars to be shipped downstream and out around the world. If you are, it's 7:35 and you're probably sleeping because it's hard to haul 100-pound sacks of flour around all day. So we have other myths, if you will, myth 2, that tells us how we got to be where we are. What I'm going to offer you tonight is a chance to begin to think about myth 3. And myth 3 is, where are we going? What kind of river will we have? It's important to know those first two. We're always going to have to tell Mississippi River 101. We're always going to have to tell those basic stories about Huckleberry Finn, about flour milling, about the Underground Railroad. Well, the Underground Railroad actually is kind of a myth 3, because we don't think about the river as the Underground Railroad, but it is. It was. What meanings the Mississippi River is going to have for our population going forward. It's no secret that our population in the Twin Cities is going to, in the next 40 years, be less white, more mixed, racial diversity. It's going to come from different parts of the country. I've been in I don't know how many meetings at St. Anthony Falls where we're talking about trying to find ways to get the East Africans from the Cedar Riverside neighborhood to come down and enjoy the amenity of the planning and the parks that we have at the Central Riverfront. And people say, well, once we tell them about Pillsbury, they'll want to come. Really? Maybe, maybe not. We don't know, and that's my point. We don't know what would be attractive and what would be interesting and what stories of water are stories that are part of the mythologies that people who are new to Minnesota bring with them. When we talk about the importance of thinking about water in the state, about whether or not it's a good idea to drain White Bear, or to not drain White Bear Lake. White Bear Lake's already draining, thank you. But to pump the Mississippi River water and you'd have to pump it because it's got to go over a height of land to get it into White Bear Lake. It's a $25 million or so project. Everybody says, well, Minnesotans love water because Minnesotans all go to the lake. I don't have a lake place. Maybe some of y'all got lake places. That's great. But think for yourselves now about how much or how little sort of up to the lake is part of your story, part of your family story, part of your origin story or your continuation story. It is or it isn't. My point is that I don't think we can really assume that it's that for everybody to the point of making public policy out of that. So, the 1950s, 1955, this was when these overflights were made. Now, what I'm going to do basically for the rest of the time, because I've given you sort of the idea, okay? I mean, the idea part, if you're a note taker, you got most of the notes, you know. I hope they got on the record because I didn't plan necessarily. But we have these, and so what I want to offer you is this, and then we have the contrast. And these are things where I'm going to invite you particularly to put your hand up and ask a question. If you have something that you know that is distinctive, that like, you know, no one else will know, or something about, you know, like how these got there or something like that, bring it up. I think for each of these, there are probably myths myths, meanings, I'm going to sort of stories we can tell. So this is arguably the origin of Minnesota, unless you are of the people who understand this to be a place of Wakan, Dakota for spirit. And if you are Dakota, this is maybe the origin of what they call Minnesota Makoche, but not Minnesota because of Pillsbury or General Mills. It's part of Bedote. Bedote, now I'm going to get this wrong. I am not Dakota. I'm telling things that Dakota people have shared with me. So forgive me if I get some of the story, some of the meanings not exactly right, but not being Dakota, not having grown up with that, it's not always my sort of firsthand story to tell. But Bedote, a place where two waters come together, Bedotes are significant landscapes in Dakota cosmology, which is all about relationships. And the primary Bedote, the most important Bedote, is the juncture of the Minnesota, what we call the juncture of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers, down by Pike Island, Witatonka, down by Fort Snelling, down where those two rivers come together. But if I were to ask some of my Dakota friends, is this Bedote, they would say, maybe. Because the Bedote doesn't really sort of have a boundary. You know, for Dakota people, you don't say, oh, I'm in Bedote, now I'm out. I'm in the Bedote, so I have to be very careful and be very mindful of my relation with this place. But over here, I can do whatever I want to. It doesn't work like that. And so when we ask as resource managers, Dakota people, is this significant? Is this sacred? They kind of don't know what we mean. Because what we're asking them is this place spiritually significant by definition, by category, as opposed to over here? And it doesn't work that way. Spirit Island, a extrusion of limestone as the river receded. So the falls at St. Anthony, which is right here, 12,000 years ago, was at about Robert Street in St. Paul. And what you had was limestone over a bed of sandstone. And what happens if you take any of your water or your beer and you pour it too slowly is that the liquid runs back up the side of the glass, right? So when you do that, the sandstone we have here is extremely soft, very porous. The water eroded it away, so that over a 12,000 year period, the falls at St. Anthony eroded from about Robert Street in St. Paul. We haven't got too many St. Paul people. I'm a St. Paul guy. Kevin's a St. Paul guy. So it got out of St. Paul as quickly as it could and came to Minneapolis, right? Okay, we work with that? Betraying my home place. And it came to about here. When Father Hennepin one of my colleagues calls the errant falsifier because he didn't know where he was, he didn't know what he was doing, and he didn't know who he was talking to, but he wrote a book that was a bestseller all over Europe. The Errant Falsifier. When he got here, the falls was about there in 1680, and they retreated in 200 years to about there, which is where they're stabilized by the Corps of Engineers, so they don't continue to retreat to here, at which point there's not a falls anymore, it's just a rapids and there's no source of water power. You don't have Minneapolis as this world's leading producer of flour because there's not a fall sufficient to generate power. This piece of limestone was extruded up through the sandstone, so it was kept there as it retreated. It's got trees growing out of the rock, apparently, and it also had eagles. There were apparently, I say apparently because I don't have the fact, I don't have the citation right at the tip of my tongue, but Jonathan Carver, an Englishman who was here in the 1760s, reports that in this immediate vicinity, there were dozens of eagles' nests. We got 40 in the National Riverway right now. It's a national park. We got 40 eagles' nests now. There were dozens there 250 years ago because of the rapids in here. Now, it's not rapids now because we've engineered the river. That's one of those stories we tell about who we are and what we do with the landscape. But nevertheless, there were all these rapids. There was this island. So this is Spirit Island, an important place, a place where people come from around North America to gather seeds, to gather medicinal materials of all kinds. It's gone now. Now, when we got here, when the white people got here in the 19th century, we were telling stories of the landscape and assigning these stories to the people who were here before. And so we would say, okay, when you get here at the falls, one of the voices you can hear through the mist and the roar of the water is a Dakota woman whose husband took a second wife, and she gathered her baby and got in a canoe and singing her death song went over the falls. Dakota friend of mine says, look, that's a story you guys tell. Dakota women don't kill themselves over guys. And Mark Twain made a similar point in Life on the Mississippi when he's talking about how many maiden rocks and lovers' leaps they are. And these are all up and down the upper Mississippi. Wherever there's a promontory, there was a story added by Europeans of some lovelorn indigenous woman who jumped off rather than marry somebody she didn't want to marry. And the way Twain ends up telling this, I think it might have been at Maiden Rock in Wisconsin, that the woman jumps off, lands on her parents, kills them, she gets up, walks away fine, and gets to marry the guy she wants to after all because the parents are now out of the picture. He had a good sense of how to work the stories he was telling. So the stories we need, I'm just going to say, the stories we need to understand going forward are the stories like this, the stories of the plurality of voices that inhabit our place, the stories that speak to the full range of people's mythologies, people's sense of meaning, their sense of themselves that's here. Because as we go forward, we have to have, I would suggest, we have to have more inclusive stories to speak to how we can live here more sustainably over a longer period of time. The stories we've had have been really good stories to tell us things for a little while, and we talked about that sort of story too, that story that talks about how we've gotten to here. This tells us things like the recent renovation of the Pillsbury A Mill. That is an astonishing place. I was in there last week with the St. Anthony Falls Heritage Board. It's artist housing, and I'm thinking, will they take color crayons and stick figures? Because I mean, I can get my kid to buy some, because he has to. He's my kid. He's 29. Maybe he doesn't have to do that anymore. Maybe he used to. But I mean, I can call myself an artist. I can do some stuff. I might do that to go live in there. It's an amazing place right in the heart of the city. If any of you are artists, go take a look and see what the waiting list is about how to get in it. They have the roof of this. We were up there. We were up on the roof at sundown, sort of looking back across the city, and it's kind of amazing in part because over here at the Phoenix, you've got the same kind of view for like 20 times the cost. So we are doing things right to make this heart of the city, the heart of where the city might go forward, and what we've done to preserve so much of the, I'd say, World Heritage class. I mean, this is a World Heritage place like the pyramids or any other kind of place like that. It's one of these sort of top 1,000 most outstanding universal story places on Earth because of the way that water was incorporated, all of that sort of story one stuff, that the ways that we tell who we are now, how we've come to be where we are now, that sort of story too is enacted in this landscape. It's in the story of how we have Gold Medal Park. It's the story of Mill Ruins Park. All of these other highly innovative things that are part of what makes Minneapolis widely and regularly regarded as having the best urban park system in the country. Really, the flagship, I mean, okay, we got the lakes, fine. This is really where the action is coming, and this is a regional park that has 2 million people a year. This is actually geographically in the heart of the Mississippi National River and Recreation Area, unit of the National Park Service, established in 1988. The park has about 100 acres of the 54,000 acres within the border. We could talk a lot about how the border got established, all that kind of stuff. But nevertheless, this park has almost as much visitation as the Yosemite, the Yellowstone, the Great Smoky Mountains parks. And those are the ones we think of as the flagship parks. When you think about national park, you're thinking about El Capitan, you're thinking about Old Faithful and this kind of stuff. The National Park Service has an urban agenda for its second century. The National Park Service's centennial is in 2016. Their urban agenda talks about recognizing places like this and those unique characteristics as destination places for a place that is as powerful as any place on Earth. Outstanding universal value means that the things that happened here are universally important to all of us. Harnessing of water power. This was the largest direct drive hydropower concentration in the history of the planet. The first hydroelectricity for a municipal use in the Western Hemisphere was here. All kinds of things like this. But what makes this, for me, part of that story that is about sustainability and inclusion is an understanding that in order to do that, in order to manage these waters, to pull water off the river here into a gatehouse, bring it down here under the West River Parkway, there's a canal under there that powered these mills. There's similarly a canal here under Main Street. In order to get that to run consistently all year long, including late summer and fall, the Army Corps of Engineers built dams on Lake Winnibigoshish and Big Sandy, and Pokegama. There's 5 of them up there. They're federal dams built in the first decade of the 20th century to store water when the water was running high in the spring with the snowmelt, and then to let water out so that there would be consistently enough water all summer and fall to power the mills. Great idea. Managing a water resource to engage industrial use over the whole year. When Mill City Museum, the Historical Society, was talking about Mill City Museum, and they were making a pitch to the Indian Advisory Committee about this in 2001 or 2002, the museum opened in 2003, they were talking about how here we learned how to harness water power to feed the world, and one of their Ojibwe advisory committee members says, yeah, you fed the world by taking rice from our mouths, because those dams flooded rice fields, flooded rice areas, they flooded village sites. There was no compensation. Just go. You're on the reservation, go somewhere else on the reservation. If you were on a reservation at all at that point. Those are important stories to have. Those are important stories for us as I'm making an argument here. You don't have to believe me. That's not on the midterm, right? When I'm in class and I'm doing this, I'll tell the kids, okay, pencils down, rant coming. Because I got to tell them, I mean, what part of it is a rant that they don't have to listen to, and what part they have to sort of listen to and feel like, okay, yeah, right, crazy liberal guy, write it down, fine. You're not the hippies in the 60s anymore, dudes. Okay, in the 60s, I was not a hippie. So, but to have a sustainable relationship with this planet, we have to understand the things we've done to it and done with it and how we've understood and altered the systems. Those are the stories 3. That's that 3rd generation of stories. These are the stories that we can still tell and we can still enact on the Mississippi River here. That's our place. How many of you went to university? All right, good. It's always nice to see a bunch of you there. And it's nice to see the people who went to the university. I won't speak for some of the rest of you, but you're still proud enough of it to hold your hand up. I mean, I like that. I mean, I really do. I'm maybe a little Pollyanna-ish compared to some of my colleagues, but I think it's great that the university is highly respected here. So we have Bohemian Flats, a story of where there were 1,000 people, give or take, living down there 100 years ago. They weren't down there because they were unemployed. They weren't down there because they couldn't live it was like a homeless shelter. They were down there because this is where they came and landed, where there was cheap ground rents, while they could get a stake until they would move up into Cedar Riverside or some other parts of the city. We've done some work with some of our students looking at the Bohemian Flats, actually reading some of the historical literature, reading some of the newspaper accounts, reading some of the census records, and they've gone and they've given presentations. They've had an exhibit at Mill City Museum, and people always come up and want to talk about their grandparents who were there. I mean, this is one of these enduring ties of tales from who I am based on who my grandparents were and where they were. That tie to place is something that I honestly don't think any amount of the world's knowledge at my fingertips or anything like that can quite replace. I'm an old school guy in terms of believing that there's something about being physically in a place that has a lot of value. I mean, we are animals after all. We inhabit a physical space. Maybe not to the degree of understanding the DNA of the dogs, but notice I don't have no slides yet, just pictures, or no charts and graphs and stuff. I don't know anything. We can say there's 35W. The new 35W bridge is there. There is no 35W bridge, 1955. But this is something else. Now, this is kind of, I always find this to be interesting, but then I have, a pretty low threshold for being interesting on the Mississippi River. This is what I do. But right here, so this is a set of massive coal piles that the city of Minneapolis established because they had to have the head of navigation. Now, how many of you got a brother or a sister? Now, how many of you have wanted something that your brother or sister has just because they have it? They get that thing for Christmas, you want that thing at your next birthday, whatever it is, okay? That is an almost universal dynamic. St. Paul was the head of navigation. So St. Paul was the head of navigation on the Mississippi because the federal government had bought the Fort Snelling Reserve upriver, and then upriver from that in the Mississippi River Gorge, the river was too rocky and too many rapids to be really feasible for navigation. In one year in the 1850s, there were 1,000 steamboat dockings in St. Paul. There were 50 in Minneapolis. So Minneapolis, you could only get to Minneapolis by boat in really high water. So as soon as Minneapolis could move these guys off of there, in the middle of the 20th century, they did, and they put in a loading dock. And that was great. And then to solidify their being at the head of navigation, they also, in the mid-20th century, built the lower St. Anthony Lock and then the upper St. Anthony Lock. They started agitating lobbying Congress for the upper St. Anthony Lock in the 1930s. Tried to get it in as part of the whole lock and dam system from St. Paul downstream to St. Louis. Nah, there's not really enough traffic. Oh, but there will be traffic. There will be traffic if you build it. There will be traffic. Build it and they will come, right? In 1965, Upper St. Anthony Lock opened. And it was in 1968 or 69 that General Mills moved out of the upper Mississippi, of the central Minneapolis riverfront to Golden Valley to a corporate campus. They were centrally involved there for much less than a decade. And I think the moral of that story, since we're talking about stories and meanings, the meaning of that story is be careful what you ask for, particularly when you ask for it for 30 years. Your needs might change. You might not need that anymore. And it's closed. This closed in June of this past year. We've been talking for a decade or more about trying to get the lock closed so that the river can be used for something other than navigation through here. And people says, well, it takes an act of Congress to close a lock. And about 5 years ago, we would say, well, Congress passes laws, Congress acts every day. And then, of course, Congress stopped passing laws and stopped acting. And so then it became something where they didn't do it. But last year, in the WERDA of 2 years ago, in the WERDA of 2014, they said that 1 year from the date of signing of that, this would close. This gives us a historic opportunity to think about what the future of this area is going to be. As the Corps of Engineers stops dredging because the head of navigation is no longer up there, there's no longer commercial navigation through the lock here. As the Corps of Engineers stops that dredging, what might happen in its place? Can we manage it more actively for habitat? Habitat of what? Do we even know what the river's actually going to do once the Corps stops pulling sand off the bottom and dumping it on the upland somewhere? Actually, in fact, we don't. We're part of a study from the Legislative Citizens Commission on Minnesota Resources to try to get a sense of the biological and physical system that's in this place right now. Where's the bottom? What's the bottom consist of? What kind of fish live in there? Where are there mussels? What kind of aquatic macroinvertebrates live in there? Possible Café Scientifique in a couple of years when we get that study done. I will get the chief scientist on that working on her sort of patter talk right now, because this is a crowd where obviously the presentation level goes up. So this is sort of, I think, maybe the last pair I want to show you, the last pair of slides, and we do have plenty of time for questions and conversation. This is, anybody can tell where this is? Anybody who was here, this is 1955, so if you were here in the 50s, you might be able to recognize where this is.
Lake Street Bridge there.
I'm sorry?
Is that the Lake Street Bridge?
No, not Lake Street. It's not Pig's Eye. It's not Ford. It's not no, it's not Nicollet. Hang on. So this is what it looked like in 2013. Plymouth. Broadway. Plymouth, Broadway, the same railroad bridge, a whole railroad roundhouse here that is still in the landscape right up in here. That was a whole parcel in there that was going to be an amphitheater and it was going to be a public space. And then by some kind of deal where a developer knew a city council person who knew a developer who knew another city council person who knew a banker, it suddenly became privately held, and that's now private Riverview townhomes up in there. Now that would never happen in Minneapolis, of course. This is, that's a Chicago story, right? But what else we see here is this. The north side, not blocked by here, but not necessarily blocked here. And if you go up on the north side today and you talk to people who've lived up there for a couple of generations, they'll tell you that fishing in the Mississippi, swimming in the Mississippi, use of the Mississippi as a recreational amenity, as a supplement for what they were able to buy for food because you go fishing. That was a regular part of people's lives. No longer. It's just not. It's almost impossible to find ways to surmount this, partly as a physical barrier, and there are people working on the physical barrier, figuring out a land bridge over the freeway or something like that, but partially just as a conceptual, as a kind of cognitive barrier. If you're up on West Broadway, you don't think of yourself as being a mile from one of the great rivers of the world. It's just not in your head, but it's there. And so my question is, what can we do eliciting stories from people who've been there, finding other stories about when we were seeing the river in these manners, hearing from people whose fishing of the river was part of their experience of it, who swam in some of the shallows along in here, who went to Hall's Island, and see how that can become part of the stories of the community as the community starts to refigure itself and reorient itself toward where it needs to be going forward. Now, the park board is doing some planning around this right now. They've cleared out Shearer Brothers Lumberyard right here. That is now a park. And the park board has looked into what it would take to recreate Hall's Island. Part of that is a hydrology question, a fluvial geomorphology question. Part of it is a legal question. You cannot just dump stuff in the river there until eventually it comes above the level of the water and then dump some more so that you have an island. So you got to really rethink. There's a lot of complicated pieces of this. Part of my question is, who needs to be consulted about that? Who do we have to talk to decide that's a good idea? Not everybody necessarily thinks it's a good idea to either build a new island or to cut this one back off. Probably, my guess is that this just got filled in rather than dredging out Hall's Island. My guess is this is a variation of that outer edge right in there. But I don't know. I'd have to do a lot more study to try to look at that and figure out. But these are studies we need to have. We need to know the river much better. We need to know how the river works much better. We need to understand a lot more about it and how we can live with it before we can live with it going forward. Back to the campus. So what I do for a living. This is the shameless self-promotion part. She told me I could do this. So my program, really, when we do research, what we're primarily interested in is how the river systems, the surface water systems that were here when whites came, how have those been converted to the urban system that we have now? Right now we have an urban water system that gives us clean drinking water, that provides sanitation services, that gives us power, that gives us transportation. It provides amenities for us for all of these parks, all of these great homes and so forth that we have right alongside the Mississippi River, and it's providing water for food. Increasingly, urban agriculture is a part of how we're feeding people in this community. What have we done to go from where we were 200 years ago to where we are now, and who benefited and who controlled that and who managed that and who didn't benefit? And how can we address some of that and rectify some of those things going forward? We start this fall in a journal. It's a digital journal called Open Rivers. I have a couple of business cards. I can give those to you, and you can send me a note, and I'll put you on the distribution list to hear about this. We've promised this for fall 2015. The solstice is at 10:50 on the evening of December 20th, and I've told my staff that we might need every one of those times. We might push that open at like 10:45 that night because we're still scrambling madly to figure out the web platform and the basis for it and all that kind of stuff. My Mississippi is a program we're starting where we're actively reaching out to seek stories from people that we don't traditionally seek stories from. what we've done here. I mean, we got great river resource management companies or agencies. I know a lot of these people. I work with them all the time. What they typically do is they'll say, let's gather river people, and they talk with who shows up, rather than going out and finding people who don't show up but who might have knowledge. But they're not there because they can't get childcare. They're not there because they have to work that night or something like that. So we're actually actively seeking stories so that a broader cross-section of the community will feel like it is my Mississippi. They'll feel ownership of it. And as they have ownership of it, as they see themselves in their stories, in the stories that are being told, in the landscapes, in the public space that's being shaped there, as we take public space and make it civic space, civic engagement space, then we'll branch that out. And we also do curriculum. I won't pitch you, the talk I gave this afternoon was to a freshman seminar, and right after this, I had like my class for the spring, which I have to have 10 people to be able to offer, and right now I got 3. So it's like, come on kids, sign up for the class. You can sign up for the class too, that's perfectly fine. That's the website for us. That's my email. I'd be happy to hear from any of you. You'll probably get a real-time response back, because responding back to you is probably more fun than what I'm supposed to be doing. I'll go email on people and talk about river stuff all the time, particularly if I'm supposed to be writing something on deadline like a grant. That's the heart of the matter. That's the basic pitch. Questions or comments, observations?
Thank you. We'll take questions. Here we go.
One of my questions was about when you talked that people used to fish and swim in the shallows, and as a way of subsisting their diet.
Yeah.
Is it safe to do that in the Mississippi now?
Yes. So the short answer is yes. The medium to long answer is that the Mississippi in Minneapolis is impaired. That's Clean Water Act language. It's impaired for sediment. There's too much dirt in the river. It's impaired for E. coli. There's too much poop in the river. It's impaired for heavy metal like mercury because there's too much coal-fired plant atmospheric deposition from upwind comes and lands here. And there's too much either phosphorus or nitrates, whichever one we have a freshwater impairment for. One is freshwater, one is saltwater, and I can never remember which is which.
Phosphorus.
So, phosphorus, okay, thank you. So if you went swimming in the Mississippi, if you went down to Fort Snelling State Park, if we get another nice day, this before winter comes, and you went swimming, if you had like a cut or an abrasion or something, you'd want to scrub that off when you went home. You probably don't want to just take a big glass and gulp it down. And that's a state level significant walleye fishery down at Fort Snelling. It's catch and release, but if you catch and don't release and take it home and eat it, nobody should be eating those more than once a month. And they say women of childbearing age and little kids shouldn't eat them at all. So there's nuance. There's nuance to it in terms of whether it's safe to swim in, safe to eat fish from. It's cleaner than it's been in 150 years. It's not as clean as it might yet become as we start really understanding what's going on upstream. But the water quality sensing that's going on now in central Minnesota, they have some call them CAFO, confined animal feed operations. So when there's a breach at the manure lagoon at a cattle or swine holding operation, you can tell, because there's constant sensors in the water, you can tell when that comes to the water intake, shut it off. It's St. Cloud. St. Cloud tells Minneapolis. They know how fast the river's going. They know exactly when to turn the water intake off, let that stuff go on through, turn the water back on, and it's fine. And this is before the water goes up into the treatment plant. They can just regulate knowing what's in the water, when to turn it on. And they have like 3 days supply in lagoons here. So more than you wanted to know. That was the mid-level answer.
Okay, I have a couple questions. One, and they both deal with dams on the river.
Okay.
And I believe the Ford Dam was put in the 30s, I believe.
17.
17.
1917.
And is there, obviously there has been talk about removing the Ford Dam, which would bring back the river to its more natural state in Minneapolis and St. Paul. And I just wanted a little comment on that. And then also whether or not those dams that were built to regulate the water level for the mills upriver, is there any thought about taking those out?
I haven't heard anything about taking the Headwaters dams out. That would be an unpopular suggestion because that's now people's lakefront. So you take that dam out, and suddenly, instead of my yard from here to the back of the room and then the lake, it goes from like here to the whole back of the building back behind the bowling lanes, and it's mud flats. I'm going to be against that. As far as Ford goes, the dam at the old Ford plant is generating hydroelectric power under a license from FERC for Brookfield Manufacturing until 2034. And so if that dam were to come out before then, there would have to be some compensation to the power company. There's also 1.5 million cubic yards of sediment behind that dam. And that's like going to be way better than what would fill this building. So you'd have to do a lot to figure out. I was just at a meeting about this on Friday, as a matter of fact, so I know this stuff at least a little bit. You'd have to figure out how to take the thing out so that flushed out. And we don't know what's in that. It's been building back there since 1917, so it's probably pretty nasty. But the thing is, we don't know is how much that would restore the rapids in the gorge that were there. I mean, when Zebulon Pike wrote his trip account in 1805, after he had signed a treaty with 2 Dakota people at the island that we now call Pike Island, Witatanka in Dakota, it took him all day to get his boats up to St. Anthony Falls. It's about 8.5 miles, and it took him all day of pushing against the current because of how many rapids there were. We don't know if those blocks are still down there because there are plat books in the late 19th century showing a bunch of islands in the gorge owned, incidentally, by Bishop John Ireland, or Archbishop John Ireland. Don't know if those islands were just taken out or if they were sand and they were dredged out or if they were limestone remnants of the recession of the falls and they're still down there. There's a lot we don't know about what the bed conditions of the river are under the water that would have to be known before the restoration would happen. But that conversation has started. You're quite right about that. Nobody's under any illusion that it's going to go fast. Yeah. The knowledge man.
Along with other things about the Ford Dam, a myth that it's being undermined. Is there some danger that it's going to break away?
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I'd be surprised if it got built on a really shifting foundation, but stranger things have happened. So I tell you, I don't know that. I don't think it's true with dams what they say about levees. They say there's only 2 kinds of levees. Levees that have broken and levees that have not yet broken. That's true about dams in a very long time scale. I mean, dams, I did a conference on this several years ago. Dams are really experiments. They're very long-term, centuries-long experiments, but it's an experiment on the river. But if we understand, as one of the native speakers in our conference said, if we understand that rivers are the circulation system of our planet, then we have to understand dams as blood clots. They're serious. So I don't, but the immediate answer, I don't know.
How much did the threat of Asian carp moving upstream have to do with closing of the upper lock?
It caused it. I didn't say that. It caused it in the sense that without the threat of the carp, Amy Klobuchar is not interested in closing the lock. I heard also on Friday that part of Senator Klobuchar's interest was that she had basically caused herself a lot of damage with the environmental community with her support for the Stillwater Bridge. So she needed to make nice with the Greens. This was a way to do that. Without the threat of the invasive carp, we're not talking about closing the lock. Now, two qualifications on that. One is the Corps of Engineers will not stand for having the carp be a reason written into the law about why it was closed, because that would open the floodgates, if you will, toward manipulation of the water system in response to carp in Chicago. We're spending tens of millions of dollars to electrify parts of the Chicago, Illinois river system to keep carp out of the Great Lakes. And you know, the guy who lives in the White House is from Chicago, and he's got pretty strong political on both sides there. We're just not touching that. So WERDA wasn't going to say carp in it anywhere, but that's why they were there. In fact, though, that lock hasn't been paying for itself. So these locks are nominally paid for by a diesel tax on the towboats. And those locks, the operation on those locks, and you have to see them all three, Ford, Lower St. Anthony, and Upper St. Anthony is all of a system, all of a piece, because once you don't have the first one, there's no reason to keep the other two open. Those two don't pay for themselves once the cargo going through them is lower than about 1 million tons a year. And it hasn't been 1 million tons a year for a decade or more. So they were not economically feasible any longer. The Corps is never going to close the lock on the lack of economic feasibility, because it's not how bureaucracies work. So you had to have something else. That something else, which could not be named, was carp. Now, that said, if we open Ford, or we take Ford out, does that mean there's just a highway up to northern Minnesota for carp to come in and decimate the walleye population in Mille Lacs, the 3 that are left, or the rest of the upper river? No, it turns out that the carp, they can jump out of the water, but they're like sprinters. They can like travel from here to there and go really fast, and they're real strong swimmers for that length of time, but they're not distance runners. They can't swim like across the building. So if we took Ford Lock out, we'd have to put some rapids in that extended for a while, and if we did that, you've got just as effective a carp barrier as if you had the wall. I just learned that on Friday. The scientists, if he were here, would be going, no, we don't have data. But I just told you anyway, but I'm a historian. What the hell? I can tell you all kinds of stuff. I'm on overtime now, right?
You're doing good, yeah.
Overtime with
This
the
is
pay I already get.
more of a comment. From the Lake Street Bridge in a very dry year, you can see the old locks, Meeker
You can see Meeker Island locking down.
Meeker Island lock and dam.
Yep.
And it seems like there'd be a lot of things to do, including maybe rebuilding the bridge supports. Wouldn't be very easy to do.
Well, I mean, if you had the water, so say we wanted to do some kind of restoration in the gorge, and we'll get away for the moment of the question about what does restore mean in an era of climate change. Because it's not going to be back to the climate situation. It's not going to be back to the biological assemblage that you had 200 years ago. But let's just, we'll leave that aside for now. If you got less water going through the system and going through in a much more varied rate, but it's going faster, you would probably want to anchor your piers differently than if you're in a lake situation. That's quite right. But you could anchor the piers and call it good, would be my guess. Now, there's probably engineers in the room who are just doing the face plant, because I'm not a scientist. I'm also not an engineer. So that gets me qualified to talk about anything, right? That respond to your comment adequately? Okay.
You talked about the importance of future myths. What is a specific future story you would like to see happen in reality?
I would like to see the stories that let the people on the north side understand that the river has historically been part of their community, and it might be part of their community going forward. I'd like for people not to be able to go to St. Anthony Falls and not have an understanding of Spirit Island and the people for whom that was important, and for who are still here. And so to tell Native stories is not past. Native people are still all in the community. They're still all with us. And to have them feel like their stories are honored there and that they feel like they can come back and be comfortable there, that I think is the only way we're really going to have a 21st century river where the public space is inviting for everyone and where they feel welcome there, even though the stories told in that public space are tough stories. Public space as a space of civic engagement where we can talk about these things, I think is a great place for us to go. I really appreciate your answering that. You're asking that.
What are some good reviews or books or, to start to learn about the different histories?
My book, obviously. I actually have a book. I edited a book after on the occasion of a year after the bridge collapse. We had a symposium, and the argument of the symposium was, in 10 years or 15 years, what would we want to have talked about when the bridge collapse was actually happening? So we had university people talk about that. I think I'm in like number 3 million on Amazon. I mean, there's, I can't. I'm not. Might not even be ranked anymore. Actually, one of the best books I think is called "Views of the Mississippi." It's by a friend of mine named Mark Neuzil, and I'm not promoting it just because Neuzil's a friend of mine. It's Neuzil. But what Neuzil's book is about is it's about these photographs that were made of the Mississippi in the 1880s and 1890s. And they're spectacular images. And what he's done is he's gathered a collection of these and then has basically annotated them. Here's what you're seeing here. Here's what this shows. Sort of here's the significance of what's in there. And so some of those go up, since they were done by the Corps of Engineers, they go up as far as St. Anthony and they go down as far as St. Louis. And it's just, they were taken at a point where the human attempt to manage the river was just getting started. So what the photographer was doing was documenting that very, very early generation of efforts on the Corps of Engineers to make the river manageable for commercial navigation. So it's right at that cusp between a more or less natural biological system and physical system and something that we have today, which is completely engineered. It's really cool. I've got about 4 copies of them. My wife keeps saying, "Do you need 4 copies of them?" Yeah, of course.
I was just wondering, you mentioned the 2 islands that are important to Minneapolis that are now lost.
Uh-huh.
How many other islands still exist? How many have been lost?
Man, that's a great question.
And
that's a really interesting question.
Is there a movement to preserve them, and is that by states or is that federal, or who? You said that somebody had owned, the island.
Yeah.
Are they owned islands?
That is such a great question that nobody has thought of it. So you would have to answer sort of by reach. And so in the gorge there were, according to these maps, certain islands in these places. In the St. Paul Reach, historically there was islands. So for example, you know where the dog park is just south of Minnehaha? So you go out, you go down, and then you go out onto the dog park. That used to be an island. What you're crossing there was a back channel of the river that got filled in once they started dredging it in the 30s for 9-foot commercial navigation. So all that's you get to a point where it's kind of low. That's all former river. And so you go over into an island. Harriet Island in St. Paul used to be an actual island. Again, filled in when they dredged the bottom, dumped all of the bottom up onto there to fill. Where are you going to put it? Put it right. You get this barge full of stuff that you've scooped up off the bottom of the river. To go down farther south, that would just be a hugely varying set of questions in the municipalities and in the states where the river's passing through.
Hundreds, thousands.
Yes. Yeah, that's a great. Y'all, this is fun. These are good questions around in here.
I'm over here again.
A short question about who's going to remediate the Missouri River.
I have no idea. I honestly don't. There's a Missouri. There's something on that's called like the Missouri River Regional Commission, something like that. So in 1944, I believe it was the dams went in. It was the Something Peck Act, and there is now a management manual for the Missouri River that stipulates how much water needs to be kept in various sections of the river by season. So if they're wanting to maintain navigation from Kansas City down, how much water has to get held in the upper reservoirs, how much water cannot be held there because it's flooding out Indian people who were flooded out when the Peck, whatever dams were built in the first place. You've got 3 or 4 federal agencies there with very seriously conflicting missions, and you've got the regional body that is trying to get those guys with the states and the major industrial groups at the table. I have no idea how that's going to happen, but if you wanted to learn more, I would suggest in a quick way that, I mean, obviously you could Google Missouri River Management or something like that. There's something called America's Watershed Initiative, which this fall released a report card for the major sub-watersheds of the Mississippi. And the Missouri River is one of them. So on the website for the America's Watershed Initiative and the report card, you'll find sources of data for their Missouri River.
So one of the stories we've been hearing in Minnesota around water recently is the dioxane levels at the munitions plant up in New Brighton. And it falls outside of the watershed of the Mississippi River, but my understanding is that it is because the detection levels we're able to detect more and more. So how do you think our stories around the Mississippi and contamination will change as our abilities to detect contamination change?
Well, that's a real good question about the ability to detect contamination. Are those levels in the groundwater or in the surface water?
Groundwater.
Groundwater. Okay, so the groundwater is going into an aquifer, and this is what the White Bear Lake example shows us, is that the groundwater, as you have more, as it were, straws into the aquifer, things happen in the surface water that are unexplainable otherwise. That's one of the things that I think, I mean, my kid is 29 and he works in fisheries in Oregon. If he ever comes back here like his mom, and I really hope he does, then his kids would be understanding that there is a connection between groundwater and surface water, and that we understand something about how those two feed each other and need to be managed together. That's the best I can offer for now, is just simply the fact that groundwater and surface water are connected is something that's news to a whole lot of people who aren't pretty deeply in the water business. As far as detection goes, I mean, there's all kinds of what they call contaminants of emerging concern that are showing up now with increased detection, sensitivity, and also just being an awareness that you got to look for things like this, like triclosan. You may know, because you sound like you're knowledgeable about this stuff. Triclosan is in surface water, and it comes in from like shampoo and body washes and things like this. When triclosan gets in the water, not a problem. When it goes through a water treatment plant and interacts with chlorine and then hits the air, it becomes a dioxin, it becomes toxic. That stuff is so bad that Procter & Gamble was trying to get rid of it in advance of the EPA regulating it. So if the industry is trying to get rid of it, you know you really got something. And so that's actually something that banned in Minnesota now. I'm pretty sure, according to the last legislative session, I don't know where that is on a national level. And of course, you can buy shampoo anywhere and like sneak it in if it's got the right stuff that. What do I know about shampoo? You don't listen to me on shampoo. But, body wash or anything like this, if it's really much better. What I'm seeing now is microbeads, plastic microbeads. There's just, plastic microbeads all over the place. We got to be careful not to just be going, oh my God, everything we do, we corrupt. Because we are going to have to be the agents of moving it forward. And if we're just burdening ourselves with everything we do is wrong, that's not a frame of mind that lets our ingenuity work to move forward. That's just an editorial loss.
I have to give two quick shout outs for activities because I know that people in this room tend to be really interested in other ways they can engage with the topics that they hear about here. One of them won't come around again until next spring and summer, but I would highly, highly recommend if you get the chance to go kayaking with by yourselves or with Above the Falls Sports, which is there might be other companies out there. I happened to guide a few tours for them last summer. But to go on their Coon Rapids to Minneapolis trip, to downtown Minneapolis trip, and maybe before you do that, drive around the north side and take a look at some of those slides and some pictures and see the north side for yourself and then see it from the river. It's incredible. I mean, it's a wilderness area that is, herons and fox and just amazing, rugged area. And you just have no, completely different story from the river. And then the other one is, and this is something that Pat and I had talked about in advance of this cafe, but this past weekend, I had the pleasure of going on something called a Bedote field trip, which is put out by the Minnesota Humanities Center in partnership with several Dakota educators with variety of topics that they educate but with the basis of St. Paul and touring St. Paul from a Dakota perspective of also not only the stories of the past, but the stories that are ongoing now and contemporary. And they offer that trip regularly too from the Minnesota Humanities Center. So those are two really interesting ways to add some layers to the stories of the Mississippi River, if people are interested. Any other questions before we wrap up tonight? Well, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you all for coming out.
We'll see you on the